You asked for her, you got her. My old Field Gulls co-host, Dayna O'Gorman, member of the Pro Football Writers Association, a member of Our Turf Football, also a regular contributor to Real HawkTalk. You've seen her there as well. She's going to come back and join me for the first time in a few months. She was at the draft. She'll give us her first-person account of how that went, some really cool stories around that, and then just her thoughts on how the Seahawks roster is shaping up heading into the quiet part of the offseason. Dayna joins me next on Seahawks Forever.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
All right, guys, let's get the business out of the way. Hit that like button on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you get notification of future episodes. You can listen to the audio version of the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. But if you want to hear them without any ads, you can do that on Spotify for a low monthly fee. You can support the show with a super thanks or by buying me a coffee. All those links will be in the description. And, you know, if you like the show, you like what I do, there are ways you can support the show that don't cost a penny. If you listen on audio, leave a rating on Spotify or a review, preferably a 5-star review, on Apple Podcasts. And you can comment, engagement, interaction, those kinds of things. It just helps the algorithm on YouTube as well. And you know that I love the interaction. Sometimes life gets in the way and I'm a little better than others on some videos of getting in and replying and interacting with you in the comments, but always love to see those. Let's get to this great conversation. Always, Dayna and I have such great chemistry. We've been doing this for quite a while together. One of the reasons I love having her on the show. She's also very knowledgeable, very hardworking, and has her finger on the pulse of the entire league through her work at Our Turf. So we don't just talk only Seahawks here. I really wanted some of her draft insight and experiences and some of the other. The 8th pick in the draft was very interesting, and she was on the ground floor there. So I got her reaction to their reaction on that one as well. Let's get into it. Here's Dayna. Well, there she is. That's Dayna O'Gorman. You know her well from our time together on the Field Gulls podcast and many, many, many appearances here, Our Turf Football, all the things that she does. You've seen her on Real HawkTalk. Thanks for joining me again. How's your offseason going?
Quickly. It's going very quickly. Everyone always talks about how it's so long between teams. I'm telling you, not this year. This year it is flying by. I cannot believe that it's almost June. Like I can't, it's too quick for me. Not that I'm not missing football, because I really, really am. But
Right.
At the same time, it's like, oh my gosh, like I feel like something new happens every 5 minutes.
Yeah, I heard a couple of days ago, 100 days to the first game, and that seemed like a long ways away. But when you take training camp into account, then it's, it'll be here before we know it. And actually, Monday is really the first time of official full squad OTAs for the Seahawks. And I think that's when things will really start to come together, because that's when we get to start to see. Now, reporters aren't allowed until Wednesday, but then we'll start to see, okay, this guy's playing here, this guy's playing here. This is how, how the position groups shake out and some of those kinds of things. And so that's when I think, especially given all the changes we've had this offseason, that's when it starts to get real, right?
Well, I have been kind of lamenting this whole offseason that I don't know what's coming, right? We had a long time where we knew exactly, kind of what to expect. We knew Pete Carroll football. We knew the players that we had. We'd get new players, and where were they going to fit into that already very well-established scheme?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we have a new coordinator. Doesn't matter. It's all still going to be Pete Carroll football. So this year, I have been a little out of sorts. I'm not going to lie, because I'm not someone who likes surprises all that much. And so I have been a little anxious about what are we going to, they're going to get. There's all these people out there who are like, oh, he's a boy wonder. Dayna, look what he's done, what Mike Macdonald has done with the Ravens. Look what he did with Michigan, blah, blah, blah. Yes. And I agree that he's still probably the best candidate they could have gotten for head coach. I'm thrilled about that. But then the little, which is rare for me, negative Nelly, which doesn't happen very often. I'm like, well, yeah, but those were the Harbaughs. You know how good those coaches are, so I start to get a little worried about that. So I'm excited now to be able to see it. I want to put my eyeballs on it, and we're going to see this much, right? Really, truly until even, I think, past preseason, we are not going to know what this team is doing, but we'll have some inklings. We'll have an idea. And so that makes me feel a little better. I don't know. I'm nervous.
Yeah. Up until this point, like all the newness has been kind of fun because it's just colored the offseason differently. It's given us, a different view and different things to talk about and dissect as far as how they approached free agency and the draft and some positional things. But now that we settle in and we know who they're going to play, when they're going to play, we know what the roster looks like. Like I didn't even usually when the schedule comes out, like everyone does, I try to predict record. I go week by week. That's a fun exercise. And a bunch of people have still done it. No shade to them, but I won't because you can't know.
I have no idea. I mean, every year is kind of a crapshoot when it comes to that anyway, because teams change so much every season, but it's really hard this year.
Yeah, it really is. Let's do this. Let me throw this on the screen here. This is, I believe this is as updated as it can get. It includes their minor signings the other day, adding Devin Richardson to the roster and some other guys. This is what their depth chart looks like right now. And in green, all the colors mean, as far as you're concerned, are guys that I think are locks for the roster. Not, but I do have them listed in order of what I think, who I think the starters will be overall. Are there any position groups still that you feel like, if there's a guy available, maybe we're a little short there, or I'd like to see us add any spots that kind of stand out to you still?
I'm looking through. I still am a little unsettled about linebacker. I'm not going to lie there, but it's because we don't know what we're getting there,
right?
We don't know what's going to happen there. We don't know what to expect. Although having Nwosu back will be huge, I think. How solid are you on center? I mean, I like Olu. I mean, there is Nick Harris. I
know.
Tight end?
I've been high on Olu since the selection. He's just a guy that I thought was tremendous value at that point. Just a very, very experienced college center at a high level, leader. Didn't allow a single sack his last year at Michigan, and a guy that I have said several times, he may never make a Pro Bowl. I don't think he's an all-pro blue chip type elite talent. But I think he's a guy you can plug in and he might be our starting center for the next 10 years. And that's something that that's been a revolving door. But it is one of the things that if he doesn't perform up to standards, that I think then they're looking for a guy. Cause I don't think Nick Harris is a starter, not long-term. He's just too small.
Yeah.
He's like Joey Hunt, kind of very, very similar physically and a guy that can spot start for you. And he certainly has familiarity with Scott Huff and that offense. And that's going to be valuable.
Sure.
But I think if he gets hurt or if he doesn't live up to expectations, I think they're out on the market looking for a center. I do believe that because of the lack of activity there, other than adding Harris, I think they have a lot of faith in him, or I think they would have added someone a little bit more substantial at that spot.
Yeah, it makes sense. Although we also know that, John Schneider has not always valued that position or that grouping. And that's fine. But I do think I'm fine with Olu starting. I just want to see him maybe progress a little bit and see, what we can get out of there.
Yeah.
Linebacker, you hit it on the head. It's the unknown, right, of linebacker for multiple reasons. Number one, we don't know exactly how I'm trying to come up with a nickname for Mike Macdonald, and I know he hates Mike Mac, so I'm not going to call him that out of some respect. But it's a bunch of people call him Old Macdonald even because he's the youngest. And anyway, so I'll figure it out when you get there. But Mike Macdonald,
didn't he say he prefers Coach Mike when he was asked about the Coach Mac thing, and he said he didn't like it? Yeah, it kind of is. It's like we just called Pete after all those years,
right? Because it's Pete, right? Yeah. But you can't say Mike. You're like, which one? There's too many. It's too common. Anyway, so sorry, I digress. But it's we don't really know how. We have an inkling how they'll be used and what they'll do with that position and that sort of thing. But he's also on his own. He's out from under, I hate to say under the thumb because that has a negative connotation, but truly under the guidance or tutelage of the Harbaughs. And so it's like, what will he do with that? So I think linebacker was an issue going into the draft. I think they addressed it, but they didn't put a lot of onus on it necessarily. Do you know what I mean? And so we'll have to see what happens there because I know that was a huge area of concern going into it.
Well, and I think I think fans would echo a lot of what you just said. And some of the reason when you kind of look at what we had and what we moved on to is we had a guy who was a first round pick, right? And there was some disagreement out there amongst analysts and fans about whether Jordan Brooks was good or not. But he was a first round pick, so a marquee type player and a guy that played well enough last year that I think a lot of people were hoping he would come back. And then of course you have the legend and his whole story. And so you move on from those two. Those are big time marquee players. And then you bring in, Jerome Baker was a recognizable name to most people.
For sure.
But again, there's some disagreement about like what his ceiling is and kind of what his role even is. And then Terrell Dotson, outstanding, PFF grades and all of that, and played really well when given the opportunity last year, but it's just a 10-game sample size. And then the Tyrese Knight thing got a lot of blowback on draft day, but I feel like there's some momentum there as we hear Mike Macdonald talk, we hear Schneider talk about him, the Brady Henderson piece about how Schneider deferred that pick to Macdonald, that he preferred Knight over all those other guys that were available.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
That gives you a little clue, right?
It
Of
does.
how he wants to work. Yeah.
And at this point, because we haven't seen it, a guy that's built his career on pretty much, and he's even outspoken and said himself that like linebacker's kind of my thing, that, hey, these are the three guys he picked. So until he proves otherwise, I'm going to feel pretty good about it. At least we know this, that group is younger. And I think as the sum of the parts anyway, they're more diverse than what we had before, because we knew that at the end of his career that, Bobby was limited.
Sure.
He's still
and yet
having
he
a
was
hard
still
time
our most
admitting that,
productive.
but it's, he maybe 10 years from now, he'll look back and say, yeah, I wasn't quite the same guy at the end there. But what were your thoughts on his comments the other day, where he didn't exactly like slam the Seahawks, but once again, it was very similar to when he left the first time. It was like, I wanted to stay. I felt a little bit disrespected. I didn't expect that from him a second time.
I'm not surprised. That group is so fascinating. Like the whole LOB and Bobby and, even some of the other players, it's the
way they're wired, right?
It is. That was what we loved about them, was that type of personality, the I can do this and you need to trust me personality. It just isn't pretty on the back end of it. But I will say this, I guarantee you, Bobby Wagner just wanted to finish his career here. And that's what he wanted. He didn't get that opportunity. I'm sure logically he understands that Mike Macdonald, as we have seen, wants to wipe all of that away. He doesn't want any of that in his face as a reminder. He doesn't want any of that as a reminder to this new team. I have a bit of an issue with that, and yet totally understand it on both sides of it. But at the same time, I think the business side of Bobby would understand that, but his feelings are probably hurt. But he could not have landed in a better place, and that's what I just want to say to him. Dan Quinn jumped at you for a reason, So I think that he's going to end up in the ring. He's going to come back to Seattle. It'll all be fine in the end. He's probably just a little upset right now.
No, it's a great point. I would even argue that I think Washington's a better situation for him.
I do too.
Than it would have been if he had stayed here. And I also think that's a great point you make about Mike really wanting to make sure it's a fresh start here. One thing that impressed me from the very, very beginning, in fact, I think it was brought up in his first press conference. They talk about the Raven way all the time. He immediately wanted to shut that down. Like, that's not going to be our thing. I'm not going to start calling it the Seahawk way. We'll figure out our own stuff. And to that point, is it, I mean, I know how I feel about this, but are you surprised that as we sit here today on, what the heck is it, May 19th, that the assumption was, especially because they had a bunch of free agents, that somehow, some way, someone from that Ravens defense was going to end up on the Seahawks roster, and yet not a single one. I mean, that's kind of odd, isn't it?
It is odd, which makes me think he wants to change some things. And that then leads me back into, we can't know what we're going to get from him because he was under the tutelage of the Harbaughs. And how much was that? And I love John Harbaugh. An evil Harbaugh cracks me up. I'm so glad he's back in the NFL. I'm not going to lie. But at the same time, there were obviously now things that he wanted to do differently. There were things that he saw that he wanted to do. And so he's getting the chance to do that. And he doesn't want any reference to anything else. This is his. He's going to own this. And I have respect for that. I do. I was real mad about the pictures coming down. I'm not going to lie, because the way it was presented in the media sounded a lot more disrespectful than it turned out to actually be.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I find it, much like you, interesting that he wants full separation of anything from the past, not just Seahawks past, but Ravens past too. He is ready to be his own person. That's encouraging.
I'll tell you this too. One thing that's really impressive to me as each day goes by is, when he was first hired, if there was any, I don't want to say criticism, but if there was any, sort of negative voices out there, it was only related to his demeanor. And he's a little too quiet. He's doesn't really, present that dynamic, strong head coach personality. But I think that's only a first impression issue. And the longer you hear him speak, like, I feel like when Mike Macdonald speaks now, it kind of sounds like he's been running this organization, this team for 5-6 years. Like, it's his, and he's taken ownership of him. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. I don't necessarily agree. I do call him beige. He is very beige. We call over on our
wise. Yeah. But I guess the word I'm looking for is I feel conviction. Like, I feel like there's a confidence there in what he's doing and what they're building here.
Yeah. Oh, I don't think he's
kind of contradicts that quietness.
No, I agree. He is definitely confident. That 100%. And I think that he is determined to make a mark, which can come back and bite you, or it can drive you forward. So that's what we're going to have to see over the next little bit. Because sometimes you get too convicted, you don't see change. And so, which we've seen that happen in the past, right? So I think that from him, what I'm seeing so far is he knows what he wants. He knows how to implement it, he thinks, and not in a bad way. He just hasn't gotten a chance to do it yet. So we'll see how he does. And, but I do think he knows what he wants. And that is, there's no wishy-washy about him. That's 100% true. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. Now, I do think that, over on our turf, we used to call Kirk Cousins beige because he was so boring. And then he started coming out with the stupid chains and all that stuff. I'm like, whatever, Kirk, in your cute little, Cole's outfit. I love it so much. But here's the thing. I like dynamic coaches. I like big personalities. I love that stuff. And the funny thing, one of my favorite coaches in football is Mike Tomlin, who is not that. Right. So I think it'll be interesting to see if he can kind of find that happy medium a little bit.
And that's why I've had such a close eye on it, because I'm the same way. Like, I look for that quality. And that's why, I said for years, I remember, when Darrell Bevel was our coordinator here, and the offense was rolling, and there every offseason it was, is he going to leave? Is he going to get a head coaching? And I was the one that raised my hand and say, he's not getting a head coaching job. He just doesn't have that demeanor. He just doesn't walk in and command a room. And there have been other guys over time. I'm actually kind of starting to get a feel like I'm a little bit hopeful that keeps Ryan Grubb around for a little while, because while I think he has a massive brain, and I feel like I get smarter every time I listen to him talk, and I can't wait to see what he does. He's very dry, and maybe that'll just give us an extra year with him at some point. If he does that. But then there are guys like Brandon Staley, who absolutely won the press conference when he was hired by the Chargers. Everyone thought he was a home run hire, and that didn't last more than a couple of years. Like, what if this doesn't work? Because not all young coaches do succeed.
It's true. That's the gamble, right? And that's why a couple of years ago, when everyone was like, Peter Russ, you had to pick between the two. And I said, a quarterback is easier to find than a head coach. And I got a lot of flack for that. They're like, oh no, you can get a head coach. Yeah, really? Go back and look at the hires over the last few years. Yeah. And that's no disrespect to Russ. I'm thrilled for his situation right now. Him and Mike Tomlin in a room just makes me laugh in my head. So, but I think that is the gamble. You can hit a Sean McVay home run, but how more often do you have Cliff Kingsbury's? You know what I mean? Right. And so you have to
great analogy,
that's why we have to really look at, what happens in these first few games. There's been a lot of conversation over, we're going to give them this whole year, and whatever happens. I don't care if they only win 3 games. And I'm like, sure, you say that till week 10. And then the tone will start to change, which is fine and acceptable. That is not okay with me. What I need to see from him is that he can improve this defense or start shuffling players if it's not working. And yet he is the head coach of the entire team. The defense is not going to be the determining factor of this. I want to see how the entire team is run. Can the offense still bring in, the numbers that they were doing before? Because I think if they do, they'll be fine. Truly, they weren't bad the last couple. Geno had his moments, but I still have him fully behind Geno Smith on this. And how do you use DK Metcalf, and how are you going to use those tight ends? And it's not just about the defense. If he can improve the defense and almost keep the offense, not the same type of plays, but at the same level, that'll be a win for me. But if you try and get through the season and only win 3 games, you're going to lose this fan base really quick. And they can say it's not going to happen, but it'll happen.
Well, and I think it'll happen if it doesn't look like we expect it to look. And what I mean by that is, to your point that you just made, which I think is a great one. When you go back and I did this several times throughout his tenure here, you go back to Pete Carroll's introductory press conference when he was first hired in 2010, he laid out a vision. This is how we're going to play the game. And then he went out from day one, even when they didn't win a lot of games those first couple of years. And you saw that immediately. Yep. Like, okay, the talent's not quite there yet. We need to dial some things in. We need to improve the roster. But that style of play that he promised us, we're seeing it on the field. Mike Macdonald's made a lot of those same types of promises about how physical they're going to be running the football and on offense, and how much better they're going to be on defense. And I think that'll, that'll carry you only so far. I think it's a good point. You have to win at some point. Because I've said over and over myself, like, I really don't care about record this year. I want to see the gap between us and the Rams and the 49ers shrink. I want to see us competitive week in and week out. I want to see the vision and kind of like we saw in 2012, like that there's a next step that we're ready for. But that does only take you so far, especially if you get off to a good start, and the schedule might allow that. We're going to look at that in a minute.
Yeah.
You get off to that good start, all of a sudden, you know how fans are. And I wanted to say here, but they're like this everywhere.
Every team.
They start out 3-1, all of a sudden,
we're going to the Super Bowl.
Hey, this is working, man. And then they, lose 4 out of 5 at some point. And what's wrong? Maybe this guy is a bust. So let's do that. Let's look at the schedule.
Okay.
This is what it looks like. Just your first initial thoughts when you saw it.
So when I very first saw it and went through it kind of a little more in depth than just glancing at it, I realized that the NFL did Seattle a bunch of favors this year. That the way this schedule is lined up, you don't have that horrid gauntlet of games that Seattle had last year, where you were just like Super Bowl contender after Super Bowl contender after Super Bowl contender, like that just absolutely murdered the confidence of the fan base and the team, right? You don't have that in this. And I love that they started with the Broncos because of my absolute dislike for Sean Payton. So I want them to come out and just ring their bell. And I think that if they can do that, they have a really strong game. And I think they're -5 right now. Like, they're actually favored in that game. Seattle is. And so I think that if they can come out and do that, what a boost, right? For everybody. Yeah. But then you go in, you have the Patriots, who also are a mess, but again, an unknown, because Gerard Mayo, we don't know what he's going to do, how he's going to run that team. We're used to Belichick, right? And so that's going to be an unknown. And then you run into a couple of really tough teams. I think the Dolphins and the Lions are going to kind of bring everybody back to earth a little bit, especially the Lions team, which is fantastic. But I just think the way it's set up, and the way you and I were talking about before, the home and away actually is pretty well balanced. Yeah. I love the week 10 bye. It's been years since they've had a bye week that long, and it's going to be really nice. So,
well, and I like the bye before traveling to San Francisco.
Well, and between the two divisional opponents, huge importance. Yeah,
that's nice. The only thing I didn't like looking at it at first glance, and I told you before we got started that the first thing I look for when I look at any new schedule is I look at it with a season ticket holder's eye. Like, there are some years that are very unbalanced, where you have 2 home games in the first 7, or you have long gaps where there's no games. Like you said, very, very balanced here. I don't love that they finished with 2 on the road. And that's actually the only thing that the league, failed to kind of get right on this one. Although if one of those had been a home game, then there might have been another tougher
Mhm.
stretch earlier on. But that's one of their rules that they kind of violated, that they penalize themselves when they grade their draft every year. And one of them is no team shall play their last 2 games
Right.
on the road, just like they don't want any team to start the season with 2 games on the road. They weren't able to make that happen. But
So they made that up for giving Seattle a second Thursday night game.
And
And so
I
they
agree
give
with
it an
you.
away game, but then they gave them a longer break. And it's
Yeah.
like, thanks.
Yeah. And there's the 2 Thursday games, which is unusual. We haven't seen that before. But I will, let's take a look at this real quick, because, and I showed this to you before we hit record.
It's interesting.
Yeah. Cause here I was thinking, and I did a whole show on it. Like, I think it's a really good schedule, and then Warren Sharp, who does such an amazing job just from an analytical standpoint in all sorts of aspects around the league. He has a metric that he built where he calculates rest days for each team. And he doesn't just look at your own schedule, East Coast to West Coast, travel, things like that, going to a Thursday night game off a road game, but also what your opponent's doing. And do they have an advantage coming into play you? Or for example, if you're flying to the East Coast to play the Giants, just to pick a team on the road, but they're coming off 2 home games, well, that's an advantage for them, right? And he calculates this into a number. And if you look here, the San Francisco 49ers got the worst of it with a negative 21 net rest days on the season, but all just barely above them at 29th down there, the Seahawks with minus 13. So it's I'm not going to go look at every other schedule of the teams the Seahawks are playing to see what they do, but he does. And as good as the schedule looks to us, it looks like, there's some teams that are going to have a little bit of an advantage when they play us.
Oh, for sure. Do you see Baltimore at the top? They don't, but that's the East Coast versus West Coast bias too. You know what I mean? I saw this great thing.
Macdonald must be going, wait a minute.
Right. So the interesting thing about it though is Dolphins fans after the schedule came out were having a meltdown that they had to fly to Seattle. They were like, why doesn't Seattle have to come here? They were like, we have to go all the way to Seattle. And I was like, you're kidding, right? Like,
with the Dolphins offense, we might be crossing our fingers hoping for a nice rainy, wet Pacific Northwest day.
It cracked me up so much that there was so much. They were so upset about having to fly to Seattle. And then Seattle fans are like, really? Yeah. But that's the East Coast, right? They have to go, Baltimore, they travel less than an hour to go to a bunch of their, opponents. So it's just, it's just the geography of what NFL is. But the nice thing is that those West Coast teams are used to that, right? Yeah. They're used to that more than anything. And those travel days and not having as much rest and that sort of thing. But it is tough. It does definitely make it for a tougher season. I think though that still it's a pretty balanced schedule. I mean, I know that it's far away and I know that their rest days are less, but I still compared to last year, I just really think that it's a much better schedule.
Well, and some of those little quick turnarounds in the Thursday games and things like that, they don't give us an idea of like that's something that Macdonald and his staff are going to have to learn to manage, because Pete became a master of that. Did. I mean, the Mike Holmgren era, those 10 a.m. games, you just chalk them up as losses, and
Pete didn't lose them.
No, and even on the quick turnarounds, he knew how to manage that, and that's something that takes a little bit, and it'll be interesting to see. My favorite part of the schedule is just the soft landing. That you do get 2 teams that are rebuilding. With, I don't think Drake May is going to be starting week 2. It'll probably be Jacoby Brissett, but I certainly think we're going to see Bo Nix in week 1 for the Broncos. And they didn't really do anything to upgrade their defense there. And so that's a team in transition. I think it gives us the best possible chance that we could have had looking at the opponents that we were tasked with, of getting some things dialed in before you start to play those great offenses, and you play the Dolphins and you play the Lions, and then you get into the Rams and 49ers. So
the interesting thing, we always, over at Our Turf Football, we always say you don't really know who a team is until week 6. You don't, because everything, especially teams with new head coaches or new quarterbacks or whatever it may be, everything has to settle in a little bit. So by the time you get through those first 4, so you get through Denver, you get through the Patriots, where they can kind of get their feet wet, dig their feet into the ground a little bit. Then you have 2 pretty tough opponents. I think the Lions are definitely the tougher of the 2, but still 2 big opponents. by the end of week 4, we'll be like, okay, this is how they handled the easy teams and the good teams. You know what I mean? We're going to have a really good vision, I think, after those first 4 weeks.
Yeah, agreed. Let's talk about the draft, because once again, you were there as a member of All Turf and had the credentials and everything. Last year, it was right in your backyard in Kansas City. What was the experience like in Detroit this year?
It would have been nice to have in Kansas City again. No, because I slept in my own bed.
Hey, but they busted out the good weather anyway for Detroit, which is not always a given that time of year. Yeah,
it was beautiful. It was great. I'd flown through Detroit, but I'd not spent any time there, and so that people were very nice and very welcoming, and we had a really nice time. The setup was a little interesting for media this year. Normally, we end up running 10 miles a day, but they actually had it set up pretty well, and so, which turned out to be a good thing. There were only 13 of the draftees there, which is the lowest number they've had in years.
Yeah.
And yet we still managed to not make it back to the hotel till 2 a.m. on Thursday night, because they took their sweet time to come talk to us. But at the same time, it was fantastic. The people were great. The crowd was insane. Like, it was
record crowd. It was
huge.
great.
Yeah. And I think it's because it's within driving distance of so many of those big football towns. It's 2 hours to Cleveland. It's, a couple hours to Chicago. So it's just not very far. And so I think that was a big part of it. But, it's so funny. You look at these draft, kids on paper a lot. And luckily, Kate was with me. Kate is with one of my coworker at Our Turf, and she had been at the combine. So she had already talked to a bunch of these kids, and she's like, oh, nice. You're really going to enjoy this one or that one or whatever. But you look at them on paper, then you get to know them personality. Once the pressure's gone, they're on a team, they lighten up a little bit. I will tell you that I fell absolutely in love with a couple of players. Darius Robinson is now one of my favorite players in the NFL. The kid's a rock star. And he was just like, okay with where he went, you could tell, but he was fantastic. And there were so many great players and fun to talk to. So we got a little bit longer time with each of them too, instead of, we've got 25 kids we've got to get through here. So that was really good. And then, the day 2, they had all already picked, so there was no one left for us to interview. So that was nice. So we could take our time and really kind of evaluate the players. So it was a different experience, because you weren't running your, feet off, all the time, but it was good. I am a little curious how it's going to go in Green Bay next year. That's going to be interesting, I think. But so, yeah, it's so fun. And I just feel like I'm very lucky I get to do that, because I do feel like you get to know these kids a little bit better.
What was the reaction like there in the crowd when the Falcons took Michael Penix at 8?
Oh my gosh. This was my favorite moment of the night. So there was going on, and we're standing there because I can't remember which player was coming in. But we were waiting because there's a big room we all hold in, and then there's a workroom. And so we were all in the holding room. And so we were waiting for this. I didn't remember which player it was. But they have TVs all over, so you can see what's going on with the draft. And when they announced it, the place erupted, and there was probably 100+ media members there. And it wasn't just, oh my God, shock. It was yes, and claps and fist pumps. They were jacked. I looked at Kate. She goes, that's not the reaction I expected. Yeah. Media was thrilled. Everyone in the room was thrilled. And then the murmur started. The whole, oh, crack Kirk Cousins murmur started at that point. But it was nothing but media loved Mike Penix. They were thrilled with that pick.
I was happy for the kid. That was my reaction. I mean, I'm here in Seattle. Even though I'm not a UW apologist or fan necessarily, but I pay attention to the program. And it's just, that was my immediate reaction, even before, like, what are the Falcons doing? Because this didn't come completely out of left field. It was well known that the Falcons sent their entire contingent of coaches, general manager, all the bigwigs came to Seattle to privately work out Penix and spend some time with him. So it wasn't like it came out of left field. Mm-hmm. And what struck me as odd, and this will get into a little bit of a quick Seahawk discussion after it, is we criticize teams all the time for not having a plan at quarterback and not being prepared, and then having to be desperate and chase a quarterback and trade a bunch of assets to move up and get one and take a shot in what is traditionally not a very successful bet to take young quarterbacks. And then a team finally goes out and kind of almost guarantees they're set up long-term for success with a very, very good high-end veteran starter. And then you protect yourself by drafting a young kid, and then we slam them for doing that. It's like, we're just never happy, are we?
Oh, no. Football fans are never happy, but they Jordan loved it, right? They saw how that worked for Green Bay. And they were like, okay, we know Aaron Rodgers didn't mentor, Jordan Love because he's Aaron Rodgers. Don't get me started. And Kirk Cousins probably won't either because his nose is a little out of joint about all of this. But at the same time, it worked in Green Bay. They had that kid. They developed him. They knew exactly what they wanted out of him. Is he going to be a superstar? We don't know, but he's been a good starter. And he was sitting there watching, learning, and doing it. And so there are people out there who are like, if you take a player in the first round, they have to start. I think the quarterback is the perfect exception to that. When you have someone of the caliber of Aaron Rodgers or of the caliber of Kirk Cousins, who they can sit and watch. It worked for Kansas City. Patrick Mahomes sat 1 year behind Alex Smith, right? And now it's worked well again. So I think it was very smart. It just was surprising that they took him so high, which then in turn makes you wonder how many we know the names of a few other teams that were very interested in him too, but how high were they willing to go? How hard were they trying to trade up? Yeah. And it was obviously a lot for them to do it.
I don't think he would have gotten past the Raiders. I think
I don't either.
They were probably as surprised as anyone and disappointed as anyone. I think that was the fit. So the Jordan Love idea is I do think it might be one that teams will start to emulate a little bit more with the opportunity. It's not often that the opportunity will match up that way. Right. I know contractually there isn't as wide of a berth here, but do you kind of think that's what John Schneider was thinking when he made the move for Sam Howell, is to kind of layer that with an eye on the future to have your next guy ready?
I think so. The interesting thing about Sam Howell, I think he played pretty well for the situation he was in. And so you already saw that he could handle the pressure, and he's so young, right? We have to remember how young he is.
Younger than most of these guys that were drafted.
Exactly. And so I think that is it. He's like, there's this kid. He's sitting there. He's good. He has pro level skills. It's not like you're throwing, a dart at a wall, and I can get him for a pretty low pick, and I don't have to sell the farm to get him, right? Yeah. I don't have to move up in the draft. I can use those picks for something else. So the people who aren't happy about that are confusing to me because I think they actually got a steal there. He is almost a better bet than getting one of those top quarterbacks in the draft because you already know what you have from him. You don't need him this year. You might not need him next year, but he's there, he's learning, he's ready. And he'll come brand new into Grubb's offense and be able to just soak that up. I think that it was the whole idea of getting a quarterback, and starting them right away was all those years of that cheap contract, right? Well, I think that teams are learning that is not always the safest bet that you can get because you don't know what you're getting. So I think that this is pretty smart of them. And I think this is their plan for the future if they see what they want to out of him. If not, it's not a huge hit, right?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the Seahawks draft specifically. I'll put the board up here again. And you'll see that I insert here because I do consider draft assets to be part of that draft. I thought the Seahawks in that 2020 draft where they only took 3 kids, or 2021 draft, the COVID draft where they only took 3. Like, so many people gave them bad draft grades because of those 3 picks and did not take into account what they used those other picks for. But regardless, your thoughts on the class as a whole? First of all, did you think it was going to be Murphy? Was that going into the draft? Was he one of the guys that you had your eye on?
Yes. Absolutely, 100%. And a lot of that came from people like you who were talking about him so much, and the guys over, at Real HawkTalk. And so then, because as everyone knows, I'm not a huge college football person. And so I rely on the end of season to kind of get caught up, which is terrible, I know, but I'm trying to do better next year, I swear. But I was thrilled that I think that that's the guy they wanted. I think they knew exactly, or, Mike Macdonald knew exactly how to use him or how he wanted to use him. And I think that was the perfect fit for him. And let me tell you, using a second round pick on Leonard Williams is absolutely fine with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Considering that they signed him, that would have been really, really painful.
Yeah,
if they hadn't have made that work, and
it would have been the worst.
Obviously, why it was a priority. I'm going to ask you if you have kind of a favorite pick. Mine is, and it kind of was initially, but the more I look at it, the more I feel this way. I love the Sataoa Lamea pick.
Okay.
Round. I think you in your first, very similar to what they did with Charles Cross and Abe Lucas. I think they landed their 2 long-term starting guards in this draft. Now, Lamea is not going to start day one, most likely. He might. If he gets comfortable at left guard, he's only played on the right side.
Right.
But I think, he was generally considered to be a guy that was going to go much higher. I love his game. I love who he is as a person and his approach to the game. He's got a nasty streak to him, and he's athletic for his size. That was one that I thought, I think if they hadn't taken a guard there, everyone would have been like, cool, we got Haynes. We addressed it. That's what we were looking for. I think that was not a luxury pick, but I think they got really fortunate when it came to the interior offensive line, which was the area going into the draft most people were sweating about. Right?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
And in a similar way to we went into last year's draft, at least day 3, thinking, are they going to take any defensive linemen? Like we don't have any. Like they addressed it this year in a big way. And that's the one I really like. I think, when you look at that depth chart that we looked at earlier, like all those years of struggling to even find someone that you think is a solid starter on the roster at some of those offensive line spots. And now, like they're going to have some decisions to make, and they're probably going to have to cut some guys that are going to go on and latch on to other rosters. That I like the depth now, especially the young depth on that offensive line.
You feel a little better about it, right? Yeah. I got a message from someone who should know after the Haynes pick and said, Haynes in the 3rd round, ? Seattle just won the draft. And it was just like, that made me real excited. Like they were really happy about that.
I never thought he'd be there at 81. I thought he was a 50 to 60 player all day long.
Yep.
Sometimes you have to get lucky in the draft.
Yeah. And then I really like what they did. I mean, Barner at tight end, that's really a good pick too, I think also. But I think you're right. Double dipping at guard and it just shows that they understand these guys are getting injured. Our backups are a disaster. You know what I mean? And there's a question there, obviously, with Abe Lucas, although apparently he's going to be just fine by season. So that'll be hopeful. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, we're starting to hear that he seems to think so. And
that's true. It was his opinion, not necessarily anybody else's. Right. But I did like this. The night pick is Tyrese Knight. Yeah, that was a questionable one. People thought that was a reach, but like you said, that was someone that they really wanted. Kudos to you if that's your guy. But I think that this was what my friend Emery Hunt called, and I thought it was brilliant when he said it, a lunch pail draft. These aren't your blue chippers, although Murphy is definitely a blue chipper. Haynes might be at that point. Yeah. But these are the guys that fill in the trenches. These are the guys that come in and make your team work. And I think they knew that's what they needed this year.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like the versatility too. Like we'll see how it all mixes and matches, but I think you are protecting yourself in some ways because we talked a little bit earlier about the center position. Well, what if Oluwatimi isn't ready or doesn't live up to their standards or gets hurt and Nick Harris isn't a week in, week out guy? There's some teams who viewed Haynes as a center. He played some center at the Senior Bowl. And I've had people come at me with like, you just drafted Anthony Bradford in the 4th round last year. And he's a physical specimen. What about him? Well, now you've layered yourself, right? What if Bradford comes out and fits in perfectly with this system and plays great? And Oluwatimi, you could play Haynes at center at some point. Lamea can play both sides. I like what they did there. I'm really intrigued by the athletic upside and love listening to the kid talk of the Mike Jarrell pick in the 6th round. Like he's might need a year or two, but I don't know. They're finally, it seems like for so many years with a couple different position groups, edge was like this for a long time and forced them to have to make a bunch of midseason trades. Defensive line was like this the last couple of years. And offensive line has been like this for 8 years, where it always seemed like they were playing catch up and they could never get ahead. So they were always then having to make desperate moves and reach. And now it feels like almost with every position on this roster next year, I think as we look ahead to next year's draft, will be that classic draft that we see the Ravens do every year. We see the Packers do every year, that they just let the draft fall to them and take whatever best players left on the board because they don't have to reach for anybody.
Yep. Best player available. That'll be interesting. I also think when you look ahead to drafts, you also have to then think it's like, okay, well, if Geno doesn't do good, are they going to draft a quarterback? Because then they have Sam Howell and blah, blah, blah. I think that there's way too much focus on quarterbacks traditionally in the draft because I don't like them, but I do think that what you say is absolutely right. They're filling the team. Right. They're filling that. And when the blue chipper falls to them, they'll be able to take them. Or when the absolute perfect free agent wants to come play in Seattle or drops to them just the way they want to, they can fill that hole as needed. I have a question for you. So interesting. Quandre Diggs put out a little questionable tweet that had a couple of people wondering whether or not he was going to end up back in Seattle. And all it said was it was so non-committal from him, but it said, with that schedule, we're going to the playoffs. And everyone's like, who's we? What do you mean?
I did not see that.
Yeah, it was interesting.
I saw his reply the other day to someone who said you should retire. And he said, didn't I already say that? But it was on April 1st. And so everybody took it as you remember he did the Marshawn Lynch shoes on the line thing. Look, there's still a lot of people that are campaigning for that. Mm-hmm. I think, I wish the Jamal Adams story would go away. I think it's been way overblown. I don't really see it as a fit. Mm-hmm. But Quandre, I could see if there's an injury or if they just don't like how some of these guys look in camp. But I think there would have to be an injury. I think they went out, made a concerted effort to bring some of these guys in, and Jenkins and even Wallace. So I think it's kind of got lost in the shuffle a little bit. They keep talking about how much they like Kobe Bryant at safety. And I think it would take an injury. I do.
Or complete, disaster at training camp, or we need some veteran leadership here, or whatever it may be. But I don't think
though. I will say that I think he would fit. I think the reason you don't bring Adams back isn't because it's not a positional fit. You're trying to force a square peg into a round hole. None of that. I just think you're trying to forge a new culture, and you're gonna bring a guy back into your locker room that you traded a bunch for, that disappointed, didn't meet expectations, and was disgruntled and had some behavioral issues. I don't know that I agree. I think I've always said I think Jamal Adams was lied to, but that's a whole different conversation because they're teams. That's what they do, right? But at the same time, here's the thing. I don't know that Jamal Adams plays football again just because that injury is so nagging. Do you know what I mean? And teams are going to be wary of that. If they do, whatever team, it will be exactly what's been laid out. It will be very specific plays that he's used on in a different role, that sort of thing. But Quandre, I do think, is a little bit different. I think that he is kind of a veteran voice that you could bring in and help some of those guys along if he's willing to do that. They're not going to pay him a lot to do it. No. And so you never know. And so, but some other team, their starting safety could go out the second week of camp. He's snapped right up. I guarantee that. So. Yeah. Gosh, it's always great talking to you, Dayna. Yeah. And, we talked before we started today about how it's a little difficult this time of year to come up with compelling subject matter and look at new ways but sometimes you just have someone on and have a good conversation about football. And that always happens when I have you on the show. So.
Oh, thank you so much. I love it. I love just sitting down and talking football, and it just is, it gets me excited for the season again. Instead of the humdrum of the off season, it gets me excited for it again.
And we didn't even talk about the division. We'll do that as we get closer to training camp and kind of as things start to crystallize a little bit. But what do you got coming up? How do you guys approach the off season on our turf? And because you guys look at the whole league, that does give you that a little bit of an advantage, aside from my narrow little view here in Seahawk world. But how do you guys handle the off season?
Yeah, over at Our Turf Football, we do cover all 32 teams. So yes, it does make the offseason a little bit easier for us. So we usually take the month of May off, which we have done. But starting the first Tuesday, because we're on live every Tuesday, we start looking at each division. And so we literally will go through AFC West, NFC West. We go through every single division, one per show, and knock down and talk about the changes and the new players and what kind of draft they had, so people can kind of get a full vision of what's going on within that division. And we announce what divisions. If you want to just pay attention to a couple of them, that's fine. But it is fun because I think it really, this time of year, we have forgotten which free agent ended up where, and we forgot who has a new head coach and who hasn't. So it's kind of get you back into a full league mindset again.
And get you ready for fantasy football season as well, too. Figuring out where all the players have landed.
Right.
My viewers were asking for you, so I hope they're pleased. I know they will be. Dayna, it was good talking to you. We'll do it again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dan.
All right. See you. All right. Always thankful when she takes time out of her schedule. Very busy schedule. They've been trying to get me on the Our Turf podcast schedule. The timing just doesn't typically work out and mesh with what I have going on, but we're eyeing an NFC West preview at some point. When that happens, I'll let you know so you can tune in to that. Until then, check out her stuff. Check her out on Twitter. I'll put all those links down below. And, well, I probably already have. By the time you're seeing this video, you probably would have seen her Twitter handle inserted at the bottom. I am Dan. You can follow me on Twitter at Seahawks Forever. Coming up this week, Jake Ellenbogen of the LA Rams content creation world is going to be joining me to wrap up my look around the NFC West. All sorts of other stuff in store as well. Forever and always go Hawks. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Until next time, we'll see you.